Next up, we have our second expert panel of the day, which will be moderated by Jessie Chan. Jessie is the Chief of Staff at Parallel Chain Lab. She coordinates and aligns the diverse business lines of Parallel Chain, including liaison with partners and customers. Coming from a background in public policy research and development, Jessie brings political insight to help Parallel Chain anticipate and navigate the changing regulatory landscape. Jessie holds a Master of Science in Policy Studies from the University of Edinburgh and a BA from the University of Nottingham. Please welcome Jessie and her panel.
So we have a great panel here. So we've heard from Nitin, we've heard from George and Anton. We have Dave Ng here, General Partner of Altara Ventures, who focuses on the working with promising entrepreneur building for future innovations. And Dave also have a technical background, graduating with engineering degrees from Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I actually have prepared a set of warm-up questions, but we probably only have time to go through two of them before we can, we want to open the panel up to questions from the audience. So let's get right into it. And I'd like to focus on the integration of Web3 into the mainstream first. But in addition to mainstream, it's actually more about the existing web and Web 2. So while Web3 projects, they attempt to mirror and enrich the consumer's real-world experiences, the way that we as consumers of these products and services actually still perceive and value Web 2 and Web 3 products very differently. So I'm wondering, how can enterprises as service providers bridge the business models and keep their consumers engaged? And what are the major challenges? Feel free, it's open to the entire panel.
So I'll give it a shot, and then we'll have the panelists talk about this. So I have this here. So I think a few things, right? One is the engagement today is still a Web 2.0 engagement. So if you're signing on, whether it's multi-factor authentication, user ID, password, you're still going through an entity that's a Web 2 entity, and then extending that experience to Web 3.0 ecosystem. So exchanges are a perfect example. You have an asset, you want to acquire an asset. So you either go and mine the asset and engage in the entire Web 3.0 ecosystem around managing your own keys, managing your own asset, which has come to light post all the things that Anton talked about, all the fiasco that we've seen the last 2 weeks with FTX and prior to that with 3AC, not your keys, not your asset. That's a Web 3.0 mentality. But I think that in many cases, as you described, this has to be a transitional journey, because it took us 30 plus years to get to Web 2.0 experiences. We understand this. We understand when we sign on to different websites, the IDaaS, the identity as a service mechanism, where we trust our Google and Facebook IDs to be on different. So we have sort of programmed our behavior around Web 2.0, and it's not as easy to take a snap and move to a Web 3.0 world where we begin to manage our keys. We begin to participate in this participative economy, system. I think that in many cases there has to be a transition, a path to eventually provide that experience, eventually enable the consumers. And that to me is a new intermediary that will be born. Like MetaMask, for example, is an example of that model. I'll pause here and love to get other opinions.
I'll add a couple of things in. And just to let people know, I started off my life in the music industry, not in financial services. So my first job was to protect against file sharing and BitTorrent. The one thing we did in that industry, which were two things we got wrong, and one thing we did right. One is we focused on capabilities. And so we built small little capabilities we thought which would be viable in the future, and we partnered to do that. So this was the likes of what we call Apple Genius or Discovering Music. And we came together as an industry, and we decided actually discovery of music was going to be very, very important for the viability of digital music in the future. And we built the capability and then syndicated it out. I think that's a really good thing to do. Does banking do that just yet? They still think they all have their own enterprises and they can run it themselves. I think there's more in common now with the banking community protecting and investing in this than there is in otherwise. We saw that with cars about 4 or 5 years ago, where the automotive industry came together to protect and develop and build new for electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So that's one area. The second thing I think is interesting just to focus on is unusual partnerships. So this is we're saying the happy conversation now, which is how do we put diametrically opposed businesses together in terms of sectors to look at creating new products and services. One of the risks and issues is that money and digital currency sits to one side in absence of the entertainment industry or the telco industry or autonomous cars. We need to bring those things together because that's what consumers want. They don't want to do banking over there and have the car drive you there. They want this together seamlessly. I think that's where innovation will come, but again, it's got to be small, controlled, very, very focused, and I think we'll find the consumer experiences will follow. About 5 years ago, when we were talking about blockchain yesterday, the answer was blockchain. No one ever asked what the question was. Consumers don't care. They really don't care about the blockchain. What they care about is, do they get a benefit? And I think with Web3, we need to be very careful. We don't say the answer is Web3 without asking what the question is for consumers first. So a deep degree of research and consumer understanding and not putting the technology before the use case.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is just on the movie studio side, typically for stuff like this, when I've talked to some of the internal attorneys, and it's really a licensing issue for us. You know, we're not directly involved with the product. We're licensing that product for that limited space. And there's a lot of discussion going on. Once again, we have a metaverse committee. We're being very, very careful about how we step into this because it seems like the climate changes every 6 months. So our only big goal is by taking all the digital assets that we create and knowing that we're building this abundant library that can be somehow used in Web3, but we're not really sure how to identify it. We're just trying to find people that we license to who we have a lot of trust and a good relationship. There's a company called Recur that we use. There's a couple others that I don't recall.
Perhaps let me chime in a little bit. I think when companies think about developing products and services for Web3, I think a couple of things that they should keep in mind, right? I think one is sometimes Web3 is a bit of a misnomer, right? A lot of people think that Web3 is going to replace Web2. No, right? It's all about the shift in computing paradigm, right? If you think about it, Web1. When the internet was first invented, right? It is really passive, right? You log on to a website, you got some informational kind of interaction out of it, and that's pretty much it, right? And what is Web 2, right? I think it's very important to set a context here. Web 2 is about interaction, right? I think when Web 2 comes into as a shift in the computing paradigm, right? It's all about being interactive, right? That was the period of time when you see the rise of blogging, social media, ability to exchange videos, information, things like that, right? YouTube, all those are your classic representation of Web 2. So the question is then, what is Web 3 and where's Web 3 going, right? Web 3 is all about decentralization, right? Consensus mechanism. So our perspective is when we talk about Web3 is how essentially Web3 is going to be built on top of Web2 and the Web1 paradigm, right? And how this will also evolve to the future. And the underlying technological infrastructure, tech stack is not going to change, right? The internet is not going to change. Your TCP/IP is not going to change. But it's all about how tech companies or businesses in general going forward in the future think about building products and technology on a decentralized basis. And that has a lot of implication, right? That has a lot of implication, from identity management all the way to authentication, all the way to approval, all the way to, even if I were to be more specific on from a vertical point of view, right? I talk about the realm of financial services. How do you exchange value? How do you exchange, do payments, remittances, and things like that? So, perhaps that's just a quick sharing of what I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the great insights. I think the answers have pretty much also covered my next question, which is about what kind of expertise and advice that Web 2 builders can offer to the Web 3 DeFi builders. So it is important to provide that kind of user-friendliness and security and confidence, but without going back to centralization. Do you have any thought about that? Like, how do you
I thought you had all the
balance?
answers. You just answered all those questions. I'm just kidding. So I think two things, right? One is, so Web 3.0 and DeFi use interchangeably, but DeFi is finance. And in many cases, I think Anton talked about in his speech, was the whole element of having the right regulatory framework, because now you're dealing with things of value. So when things of value are involved and you're engaging in financial primitives, you need to have the right guardrails to protect not just the consumers in the system, but the system itself. Only because you're building a trust system. For example, we are protecting the banking system because there's a system in place that allows us to borrow and lend and build economies and build system around it. So I think in many cases, it's not just about technology enabling like smart contracts and having DAOs, and these are great things, but you need to have a guardrails around it to say who is accountable and what do we ensure to make sure that we're protecting these DeFi with newer challenges. Cybersecurity, for instance, is a huge issue. Technology risk that goes with protocols that are engaging in offering financial services in lieu of financial institutions. I think some of these things are not just a technology problem, but a policy framework issue as well. So it has to be combinatorial to those two elements, in my opinion. And I'll pause here and to get your thoughts.
Thank you. I think
Yeah,
we
I
can,
mean,
yeah.
you know, I just on a general, you know, I don't live in the DeFi world obviously I'm a content.
But you do.
Thank
Everyone
you,
lives
Dan.
in DeFi world.
But just, you know, how do you measure intrinsic value? You know, how can you put a barrier on that and see the transparency of when your interest, obviously, you know, there's scarcity and there's things that drive value, but how do you really look? I mean, obviously, if you're investing in the stock market, you're looking at balance sheets and there's ways to connect and trust, but how do you measure intrinsic value? What is the measuring tool to know that the reality behind the product, just as you saw with FTX and over leveraged, and you know what control mechanisms that Anton pointed out that were great.
Yeah.
So how do we solve that? And once again, it's something that's frictionless, something that, you know, all customers at the end of the day care about is plug and play, you know, and they're ignorant to some of this stuff. So we need these safeguards.
Can I make one other comment? Oh, sorry, you go. You want to go?
No, go for it. I'm going to ask him a question later on.
Okay.
But.
I was going to make one other comment as well, because I always think it comes back to economic models as well, because the technology is there, right? But what do we find on the traditional blockchain, particularly in my world, is that there are very few examples of scaled blockchain ecosystems right now. Again, talking around IBM closing down one of their more recent shops, Trade Lens with Maersk the other day. So that was, the fourth one they've closed down now, Nitin? Not enough value in that to actually continue. In fact, most of the trade finance blockchain capabilities around the world have delivered negative equity to the investors. So I think the DeFi is a cool idea. Can it be programmed? Yes. But I would say for anyone who's looking to explore that space, the use cases around efficiency and the market mechanisms are fantastic, but going to have lots of scale to make this work. And I think mentors, senior people who sit in this room, and others who have been around for some time need to spend time with DeFi developers and say, right, what's your big idea? But ultimately, how do you make that enterprise scale and make that profitable on an ongoing basis? Because I think otherwise we'll have lots of great ideas that are made, but they don't necessarily go anywhere. And that is part of innovation, unfortunately. You know, for every 17 ideas, only one makes it through. But economics, I would say, is a big one to focus on. Maybe the investor will say something as well, but anyway.
Yeah, I think my fellow colleagues here, they all touch on many great points already. I think many of the underlying basics that makes the current generation of businesses and technology companies successful, it's not going to go away, right? So I think we talk about user experience, we talk about performance, scalability. All this thing will not go away. A lot of the key consideration is around how do you continue to deliver that or potentially make it better. In the same time, I think there's still, it's still pretty early days within the entire DeFi space, within the entire DLT space in terms of, some of the standards or some of the, I'll call, obvious dominant protocols or platform, right? So think about, the analogy I'll give is, I think we are still in the phase of the world for Web3 where there isn't really a dominant protocol yet, right? So this is like the world before Google come along and become the dominant search engine, right? Prior to that, you have people like Yahoo Search, Alta Vista, all Lycos, all sorts of search engine running around. Consumers are going to all these various platforms to search for information before a clearly superior platform comes along, right? So I think in a way, we're still in very, very early days. And from an enterprise point of view, right, I think the belief is at some point, there could be one or there could be a few protocols that is really high performing that comes along and set the baseline. And subsequently, we'll see a critical mass being built around them, and we'll see all the basically all the qualities that we talk about here. User experience, high performance, and all that. All the key success factors that make current generation of tech companies successful is going to be a prerequisite for any Web3 companies or any Web3 businesses that's building for the future. So,
Thank you.
Can I ask George a question? So George, when I said that everyone's involved in DeFi, and I think my perspective, the reason why I said that is because even when you're looking at, and lately I've been focused on token design, tokenomic systems that not only provide security to the ecosystem that are being built upon blockchain ecosystems, when you're looking at this immersive experience, whether it's a expensive NFT, and you had the comparison between Roblox and Sandbox or Decentraland, is your focus at some point to say this, whether it's scarcity driven, artificially created, or the countercultures like Supreme have done this, as you're looking at this in your immersive experience element, don't you view these NFTs as an asset class? And don't you at that point think about as to what happens in terms of monetization of these as an ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, right now they are talking, they're very small, simple pilot programs that are just trying to be as frictionless as possible with the customer. I mean, end of the game, we're a content company, and until this scales enough, it's just such a small metaverse relative to releasing a movie that you can get. So the scale is not there. So we look at it as a testing ground, and that's why we limit our licensing. That's why we don't get involved. We try to find companies that can take care of that for us. And that's where we're seeing, the sandbox, it's hard to tell. I mean, right now, after FTX, I mean, if you look at the charts, I mean, the monthly average users on the sandbox, which is all blockchain enabled, you see families and parents, because they have to let their kids use blockchain. That's why Roblox is so successful. They're using their own internal currency.
Can I ask one other question as well? Digital rights management, royalty payments. In the metaverse, particularly what you're doing, do you see that crossing over into currency?
I would like to see that happen. I think everybody has a big idea, but once again, there's just no correct protocol. It's just way early innings. But that's the big issue we have. I mean, if you look at music licensing, you look at rights, right now we have systems in place that track the Producers Guild, the Directors Guild, the Writers Guild, what organizations can receive, because that's the hard thing. These companies right now are trying to validate and figure out what transactions are happening, how many times a TV show has been played. So if there can be a better system in place that's simpler, is there? Not yet.
Not yet. What I'm interested in is, I think we all see friction in 1960s technology around the world, central reservation systems for travel and tourism, right? Saba, Galileo, Apollo, they're all old. Supply chain systems, same thing, all old. Banking systems, all old. So it's all there, playing out there. But I'm interested in, if you go into the metaverse and we're sitting in there, I'm in Minecraft or whatever, can I start to monetize myself? And can I actually create my own digital rights management that becomes a form of currency?
Well, within their own system you can. That's the problem. You can't have the interoperability. So I think a customer quickly dilutes the value of their brand. You build something in the sandbox, you build something in Roblox, you build something in Decentraland, whatever these places are, how can you take it somewhere else? Do you have to rebuild it? So until it's an open universe, the content creator is limited. Once that content creator has that wide scale, I think you're going to see this, because it's going to be driven by content creators. And I think that evolution will happen. It'll have to be supported by technology.
So we've talked about user friendliness. We've talked about scalability, performance, but what about consumer privacy? For example, in a metaverse world, a lot of these hardware and even software are developed by tech giants, big companies. So it actually allows them to collect a lot more biometric and behavioral data of the users than currently what they can currently do. So how are these enterprises providing the confidence? Isn't that in conflict with the Web3 values of user data ownership and sovereignty?
Well, right now, Meta is experimenting with eye tracking, knowing what your eye is looking at. There's valuable data. I think it improves their hardware. So I think there's value. If I'm being targeted by an advertiser, there are limits and controls. Just with Google, with everybody, you can actually say, you can agree to the terms if it goes beyond their own ecosystem. So, I think eventually all these companies that are charging 30%, I think we're going to move into web AR. I think we're going to move into our browsers. I think these companies long-term are going to lose out. There's not enough scalability with AR and VR applications that, everybody Web3, everybody's talking about, let's get off the broad, because pixel streaming, cloud XR is going to be fast enough. So, I'd worry if Meta had 2 billion units in the marketplace, but they have about 6 million. So, and I think they're chasing a lot of stuff, and the patents on all this stuff, they don't own it all. They don't have that much of a monopoly. So, Horizon Worlds, it's an argument as to how great that space is. So I think content creators, and there's a lot of other hardware manufacturers out there building VR headsets that I didn't mention, that are down the rim, that are just having open HTML browsers. So I think whether it's going to be a browser or not, I don't know, but I'm not too worried about the metric ownership. I think Apple's very careful about user ownership. So in the States, I don't think that'll fly.
Thank you. Is there anyone want to ask a question to the panel? I think we have time for one question.
Yes, thank you all for the very exciting and interesting presentation. George, I understand exactly what you're describing. I had to stop my 11-year-old from using Roblox when she tried to sell some land to me on that. But in any case, I'm Dr. Adi. I am a kidney specialist, a nephrologist, and I also have a health technology company, and we're using some of these tools to help to educate the patient, especially as you pointed out that the best education is to simulate an experience. So we're developing some simulations that enable patients to run some machines and to get their therapy at home instead of coming to the hospital to do it. But my question to you, Nitin, is when we talk about the metaverse, what comes to mind to most people immediately with regard to the point of interaction is more of an immersive experience. Sure. Where you wear VR glasses, you go into this world, you lose yourself to the rest, your environment. Yep. But in our experience in healthcare, and I'd like to comment on this, what we've actually found out is that the future in healthcare lies in finding ways to coordinate the real life with the metaverse. So use tools like augmented reality and AI, and then apply simultaneous localization and mapping if you're wearing the AR glasses to be able to allow that interaction between the real world and the metaverse, if you will.
So I did a bunch of research, actually. I've written quite a bit on this topic, that I view AR, VR as interaction technologies that are modalities. So I think you were describing this earlier as the mixed reality and augmented reality and virtual reality and the experiences that we have. So for example, in your profession, we also researched that with not just pharmaceutical industry, but also in terms of healthcare delivery systems, especially during pandemic, right? This thing popped up a lot in terms of, do we have enough data, not just getting data from the healthcare information and everything else, but do we actually have that interactive experience that a patient is used to, accustomed to in your profession? So the way I look at this is that many of the tooling that you see is modalities. These are entry points and access points into the system. But at the end of the day, for me to give you consent, so consent management is a huge part of the digital rights management. Consent management is one way to protect the privacy of my healthcare data. I'm giving you a fractional consent to give you access to my healthcare record so you're not misusing it. And you're having the right information for the right amount of time to make the right prognosis. And then you're done with that transaction, and then you move on in terms of providing that, and that gives you the ability to create this chain of data which is linked, the longitudinal healthcare records that we've talked about. So that's the way I view it. I don't expect and this is where all the slides and all the decks show AR, VR as a metaverse element. To me, it's just a modality, if that makes sense. I don't know if you all have a perspective on that, but.
The only one other thing I'd sort of attach the two last conversation pieces together is, we've been running an experiment with a bank here in Singapore on paying customers for their data. So you just sort of link back to Facebook taking your data for free type thing, and probably listening to us right now on the devices over there. It probably is, right? And so I'll find when I go home tonight there'll be something around healthcare on my web. But so for GDPR compliance purposes, and specifically we're looking at climate change and customer behaviour and what people do. We believe going forward that'll be part. That's why I was asking about the metaverse earlier on. We think that the shift will happen in that data will obviously be sovereign to the consumer or to the company, and that'll be consented for various purposes, healthcare being an obvious one, but other types of things as well around lifestyle, whatever. And that will change from, and I think this is where you might have been going before, from the big giants, the Googles of this world, or the Facebooks taking our data for free, to them us being prime and monetizing the use of our data. And there'll need to be a reward back. And so we've started to see that in financial services big time, where we permission data for a period of time for a certain purpose, and then we stop it. And that doesn't even go on the blockchain, it stops. But that's got to be a big opportunity. And then I'm guessing, I don't know, I'm not in your space, but I'm guessing if you're looking for diagnosis of health issues or whatever, there's a social good there that could be contracted with consumers as well over time, rather than just taking the data and taking.
Thank you. Thank you for the very great discussion. So I think we need to end the panel discussion here now and take a short break and be back at 4 p.m. for a very, very exciting session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.